there are decentralized apps and decentralized infrastructure. The interim is like centralized apps and decentralized infrastructure. And in the future, it will be decentralized apps and decentralized infrastructure, right? And so that's really how I see, where things are going. My vision here is that Web3 UX will ultimately even be better than Web2 UX.
There's no special role that Biconomy takes in this network beyond being the developer of this network and the promoter of certain technological advancements. Like anyone can join, anyone can run a node, anyone can be a solver, be a bundler, be a whatever they want. That's the beauty of designing permissionless protocols.
I'm here with Ahmed Al-Balaghi, who's co-founder of Biconomy, and Mislav Javor, who's VP Product. Hey guys, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Hi, thanks for having us. Yeah.
So Biconomy's had a really interesting run. It's a product that was launched in the last cycle and was trying to solve some major problems with user experience, specifically providing developer products that would allow developers to abstract away a lot of the complexity of using blockchains. And so I wanted to, before we go into the technical bits and talk about like the recent announcements with modular execution environment and everything, talk a little bit about the origin story of Biconomy and what were the problems you guys were trying to solve when you launched a couple of years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So origin story was, it was around 2019 when me and my two co-founders came together and we actually started off doing staking. So back in the day, Tezos was doing DPoS or for what they call it baking, which was it was a cool concept back in the day. And we essentially we ran a staking operation initially. And then we sort of realized that, all right, great, we're validating blocks, the blockchain is secure. However, we're not seeing like a lot of transactions. And so we went into the weeds as to why that was happening. And we realized, one of the biggest problems in the space, especially in Ethereum back then, was just the UX really sucked. A lot of dApps had problems acquiring users. They had a lot of problems getting users to basically connect wallets, to do transactions. And so essentially our first product was called Gasless. It was the idea that developers sponsored gas fees for their users. And this could really be for anything. It could be for a DeFi transaction, an NFT mint, a swap, anything really. And so the really cool thing here was that the user didn't need to have ETH in their wallet in order to do a transaction. And so before gas fee skyrocketed on Ethereum, that's where we were, I'd say, very active. We even had OG projects like Curve using Biconomy on Ethereum before the gas fee spiked. And that's where we sort of really focused on the L2s afterwards. So that was, I'd say, the origin story and the initial product that we launched with.
And so since then, like how has the mission evolved? And essentially we've just kind of come through a pretty hard bear market. You guys have stuck through and kept building really valuable products. How has time, say, influenced the mission and the product's direction?
Yeah, really good question. We've I'd say as a company, especially with our vision, I would say it's all about enabling and empowering anyone anywhere to navigate Web3 seamlessly. That is ultimately our vision. And that really hasn't changed. The product has changed. So we did add to it. So we did actually build a bridge initially called Hyphen. It was basically using liquidity pools to allow users to move from one chain to another. And that was, I would say, more as a direct result from applications that we saw on Polygon wanting to have like very quick transfers of ETH or other assets from one chain to another because their users were using those chains. And I would say we quickly evolved and sort of realized that account abstraction, just before it became a thing, we realized that this was going to be the future for how users would interact on chain, and for how applications would also allow their users to have accounts. And so that's where I would say we're really focused on, because it kind of provided a base for what a UX would look like. B, it would better the security for users interacting on chain. And C, it would also enable just a better flow on a single chain or even across chains, right? So we had that foresight of seeing that account abstraction would help with these different elements. And that's why I'd say around 2 years ago, the product really just focused on account abstraction. And that sort of allowed us to sort of just build, regardless of the market, because we were solving specific problems. And so, yeah, so I say this is like, personally, is my sort of third market or, third cycle. And for Biconomy, yeah, it's sort of two bear cycles, and this is a second, let's say, bull. I guess we're in a bull.
Yeah, it's really impressive. I mean, like, to see teams really navigate through the cycles and stay true to their vision. Like, I guess maybe to you as a founder, and Mislav, I'd love to get your thoughts on this too. Like, as markets come and go, and sort of like cycles come and go, how do you stay focused, and how do you find that like very narrow focus to stay on course when cycles come and go, narratives come and go, etc.?
I do think that for a lot of companies to stay focused, you need to build products from the zero principles. This is one of the ways MEE came about. MEE came about sort of in an intellectual vacuum, I would call it, where it wasn't like, is this a good narrative? Is this something that people are latching onto? Because the origins of MEE go before even chain abstraction was a term that people were using. It was just basically out of sheer frustration. Just what Ahmed said about 2019 and like with the gasless stuff and people having trouble connecting wallets or stuff like that is the same like with MEE. It was, the times changed, and having a gasless thing wasn't enough anymore because people were interacting with 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 chains, and I think we were doing that as well. And so I mean, the focus is just like what a Web 2 company would do, like what a Web 0 company would do. If you're an ice cream shop, like if you see your customers wanting, lemon flavored ice cream, you buy a lemon flavored ice cream and you sell it, right? So, and I think like just focus is not thinking too far, not going too far into your head, just looking at the market. If being a user yourself, that's like critical. Actually using the products, chains, and the things that you think your company is building for, and then just seeing where the friction points are and solving them. And that's like, that can keep you focused for 50 years if need be, right?
Yeah, I would add on to it to, I don't want to sort of sound like, this person that says, narratives are the only thing. But of course, they're not just the only thing. I mean, they do matter. We all know that they matter. And so, in a very ideal world, whatever problem that someone is solving, it does actually, it also has some form of narrative market fit, right? Like in Web3, I would say it's definitely the job of the founder or founders or even the leadership team to ensure that whatever they're doing and building, either they're building the narrative from the ground up, or they're actually part of a narrative that's also big and allows people to sort of get excited about the project. And so I would say just this is more of a Web3 phenomenon, to be honest, and it actually makes building a bit harder because founders are somewhat either implicitly or explicitly pressurized to try and find, like, try and latch onto narratives. And so it's a very, very, I'd say, difficult or interesting dance to deal with, for sure.
Yeah, token prices apply pressure, I think.
Yeah.
And in an industry where a lot of the focus is on short-term financial outcomes, specifically like on the retail side, and I think also if, and professional investors have this. Some professional investors have this short-term financial outcome focus. It can be hard to not want to latch onto the latest narrative. And so I think it's a huge achievement when you see teams that are able to stay true to their mission and have that zeroth principle approach, as you mentioned, Mislav.
But
So
this narrative is also, I would say, not every narrative is the same. I think the part of the wisdom is, churning out through all of them and seeing which ones are worth latching onto, which ones are not worth latching onto. That's also something that probably comes with a bit of experience in the industry.
Of course.
Yeah. One other thing I would say, just to on top of your point, Seb, regarding the financial gains and sort of just the outlook people have. Even if we just look at this industry, and I tweeted about this as well, and like, it's very clear the speculation is just there's just way more speculation than actual substance. And even if you look at the top 20 protocols that are actually making revenue and money, all of them have a trading aspect to it, right? So it's speculation begets speculation to some degree, and so that is what is driving the industry. It kind of that along with stablecoins are probably the biggest PMFs that we've seen so far.
Yeah, so let's talk about this modular execution environment, or the MEE framework that was announced, I believe, in November or December, just a couple of weeks ago. So, like, what is MEE, and how are you guys thinking about it in terms of bringing developers or providing developers an easier framework for executing transactions across multiple different chains?
Yeah, so maybe on a bit of a, let's call it a technical aspect, I can take that one, and then Ahmed can maybe go more onto the business part of the things. So I would say it's what we realized, as mentioned, working from those zeroth principles, is essentially the transaction model that blockchains use is not sufficient for the environment that we find ourselves in. And I think we found it necessary to actually remove the transaction processing aspect itself and execution itself from the blockchain. And this really coincides with the modular thesis, how call it Celestia or somebody, they removed data availability from the blockchains onto their separate layer. There are other things that are moving onto their separate layers. And I think we really will see this modular thesis play out in many different verticals on blockchain. And one of the verticals that we realized was really, really necessary was execution, and that modular execution is required. So what does it mean that execution is modular? It means that monolithic execution frameworks would be one which basically executes one transaction on one chain with one signature model, and it's just basically very tightly integrated with the blockchain on top of which the transaction is being executed. A modular execution environment, in comparison to a monolithic execution environment, essentially says, no, the blockchain itself is just the settlement layer for this transaction. But the way the transaction is signed, processed, and executed can be done in many different ways. So what do I mean by that? Let's call it, you have a transaction that needs to span multiple blockchains, right? So you want to swap USDC for USDT on Optimism, and then you want to bridge it from Optimism to Base, and then you want to deposit it into a lending protocol, right? So these would be 3 transactions on 3 separate chains. They are, luckily, all of them are EVMs, but they do have their own intricacies, having to set chain ID in the transaction, all of this. So basically, it's sort of enshrined into those blockchains how they would process the transaction. Now, in a modular execution environment, you would essentially encode a thing that we call a super transaction, which contains all of those transactions within itself, and then you sign the super transaction itself, and the modular execution environment makes sure that all 3 blockchains settle the transaction. So essentially how we look at it, it's multi-chain, multimodal, which means that you can sign things that are not only transactions, right? So down the line, you will be able to sign things like intents. You will be able to sign things like, certain off-chain actions. Anything that can basically be proven on-chain that it has been executed will be able to be a part of the modular execution environment. So that's problem number 1 that we solved through this model called Supertransaction. Problem number 2 is a problem of horizontal scaling. So the modular blockchain thesis and the F-chain thesis says that we're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of blockchains in the future. And we already have 100 plus. Definitely, we're in the hundreds already. So I don't see it as being a far-fetched idea that we're going to be over 1,000 very, very soon of like meaningful app chains and roll-ups and things of that sort. Biconomy has been like a leader in the 4337 space, and we do have experience how hard it is to run a bundler just for like 10 chains or 30, which was our like support here. But like 10 major chains, just running bundlers for them is extremely operationally difficult. So this is why modular execution environments are essentially collaborative, which means that you encode this transaction object, and the entire object doesn't have to be executed by a single entity. You can have a bundler on one chain, execute the part of the transaction for that chain, a bundler on another chain, execute the part of the transaction on that other chain, and then an intent solver in between those two bundlers, actually moving liquidity around from one bundler to another. And we do have a full-on permissionless cryptographic model, which enables those three entities to trustlessly coordinate and to commit cryptographically to the user itself to execute these actions. So I would say these are the two main things that we are solving. Is basically this new data model called the Supertransaction, which is able to encode things across multiple blockchains, and it removes the execution from the blockchain onto a separate layer. And then we have this collaborative execution, which enables multiple types of actors like solvers, bundlers, oracles down the line to collaborate on executing these super transactions. And on top of that, we have a very user-friendly SDK that basically enables developers to interact with this entire system as if they're interacting with like VM or like a normal blockchain transaction type, so that it's not confusing for existing developers.
Right. And so, like, I think it could be useful here to dive into ERC 4337 a little bit. For those who are not familiar with this Ethereum standard, so what does that particular standard allow, and how is MEE applying that standard?
So one of the things that ERC 4337 did is it introduced an idea of a smart account. Basically, this is a smart contract that is acting as if it's a user account. This means that you get certain very cool benefits. So this is like primary things where, as like Ahmed said, like they had this biggest pain point way back, which was Gasless, and I do still think that the biggest use case of ERC 4337 is actually gas sponsorships and then gasless transactions. But ERC 4337 is essentially much broader than that. You're able to do like account recovery. You're able to do multi-sigs. You're able to do a resource locking, where you basically certain amount of funds are escrowed. So you're able to do a lot of like very programmable things with your wallet. However, ERC 4337 is also an execution standard where it basically defines certain roles. These are called bundlers and paymasters. Bundlers essentially post your transaction on chain. They actually interact with the chain. They're extensions to the nodes of the blockchains themselves. There's a additional method on the RPC node, which enables these ERC 4337 methods. And then basically Paymaster is a separate role in this ecosystem, which can either sponsor gas or allow you to pay for gas in ERC20 tokens like USDC, USDT, DAI, or whatever else. So yeah, these are like the core principles of ERC 4337, and they're good. Like especially the smart contract account thesis is really good. And I think it's going to become even more powerful now with being enshrined into the EVM and Ethereum protocols with ERC 7702, where the users will be able to upgrade their EOA wallets to become smart contract accounts. But what we realized with building MEE is that it was built for a single chain environment. So it was basically a project that like Biconomy definitely spearheaded along with some other players in the industry. But it was done by Ethereum Foundation. They had a lot of influence there, and it was done to solve problems of Ethereum at the point when it was developed, when Ethereum was still primarily like a single chain environment with a few chains here and there, some maybe a few rollups, etc. It was never basically designed to solve this problem of the environment, which has 50, 60, 70, 100 plus chains, So yeah, basically it's a great idea. It's a great starting off point. Biconomy built some of the best infrastructure there, but it just, times have changed, blockchains have changed, and so ERC-4337 had to evolve into MEE for it to be applicable in this new environment.
Yeah, just to also add on to that as well. I mean, ultimately, ERC-437 is not a protocol change, which people might confuse it for. It's essentially an ERC, which you could think of it as a layer just on top of the actual chain itself, which developers could just use. There's no hard fork or anything at the protocol or the blockchain itself. Ultimately, what it does is it basically separates the signature verification from execution, and that's ultimately what ERC-437 is. I would say that's in a way from first principles what it optimized for, and that basically enabled all the different cool features and bells and whistles that Mislav talked about. And so for us, even if we sort of look at ERC-437 today and how we're evolving it into model execution environments, is that we are essentially, I would say, like MEE is essentially built on top of account abstraction. The major difference that we're sort of enabling is that although the contracts and everything is the same, what is different is essentially the bundlers themselves. So on our side, the MEE node is basically, you could think of it as like a V2 of a bundler. It's just a better way because, like Mislav said, ERC-437 does not cater for, a multi-chain environment, whereas NE does. And so this is where essentially this V2 of a bundler, as we describe it as a ME node, would basically have just sort of more and better features because it could accommodate a multi-chain environment. So we're still, I'd say, incorporating the core elements of ERC-437, where we're using smart accounts, using the entry point, and at least, being on the same terms as sort of what that the standards say on the on-chain side, but on the off-chain aspect, that's where we're changing things out.
Okay, and so one thing to note here is that ERC-4337 is not a protocol change. It's effectively like an on-chain standard, but ERC-7702, which enshrines ERC-4337, allowing EOAs to be converted into smart account, that would be a protocol change, right?
So ERC-7702 doesn't enshrine 4337. That's a like a common misconception.
Okay.
So ERC-7702 essentially allows users to install a smart contract on their EOA address. Yeah, it can, but it doesn't have to be a ERC-4337 compliant smart contract. Okay. So ERC-4337, that's I think a very important distinction for people to make. It's a very tightly defined standard. It's not just the smart contract account, it's also the specification for the bundler, specification for the paymaster, specification for the additional routes on the nodes, etc. So it's a very, very highly defined standard, and this is why people have been building on top of it, because it's kind of, you have a very defined way to build on top of it. But 7702, I think, is even a much, much bigger thing, is because it will allow multiple differing standards, including 4337, but also things like modular execution environments, like the Biconomy MEE, to be installed on top of your EOA. So I think that's a very important distinction to make. MEE is not 4337 on steroids. It's actually not even compliant with ERC 4337. It's a new standard which is built on top of the same smart contract accounts that ERC 4337 was built on top of, but it's a whole new generation of execution from ERC 4337. And there is also one more, like when we are spewing numbers, there is one more very important ERC. It's called ERC 7579. So the smart accounts that are being used are not just regular smart accounts, they are modular smart accounts, which means that users can install various types of modules on their accounts, which do account recovery, passkey, signature signing for transactions, resource locks, escrows, certain escape hatches. Like a lot of mechanisms can be installed on top of your account. And the cool thing about modular execution environments and Biconomy MEE is that it's a fully industry compliant 7579 module, which any user interacting with any 7579 compliant wallet can install on top of their wallet. So you don't have to use Biconomy contracts to use the Biconomy infrastructure. And that's, I think, a very important thing is like we really want MEE to become the execution environment for everyone, regardless of which smart contract account provider they are using.
Okay, interesting. And okay, thanks for that distinction. Now, the super transaction, I'd like to dial in on that a little bit. So what are super transactions? What kinds of things can we include in super transactions? And like, I guess one of the complexities here is dealing with fallbacks and how the UX gracefully handles fallbacks. So if part of that super transaction doesn't execute for some reason. So yeah, could you provide like an overview here and understanding a little bit how that works from the user perspective when there are problems?
So cross-chain atomicity is an unsolved issue. I would say nobody has solved it. So what we do essentially on this front is, I think we have gone the furthest down this route of cross-chain execution in an atomic manner. Is basically we provide probabilistic, like fix-up transactions that if certain things fail, you can revert things. But what we go like, call it defense in depth strategy, basically. First, you have the transaction. You assume optimistically that it's going to succeed. Secondly, if it doesn't succeed, you have repeat transactions within the super transaction that says, okay, try executing it now, but with slightly different parameters, So give yourself a bit of wiggle room to actually make sure that this transaction goes through. If it doesn't go through, have a certain, cleanup transaction, which, moves the state back to a certain state that it was prior. Now, none of this is as good as a proper transaction revert, but it's as far as technology will allow at this point. However, we are already in active conversations with several companies doing like block building, these things with like lower level MEV transaction ordering stuff to see, and then there are good indications that something like this will be possible to see if a cross-chain atomic transaction bundle can be encoded within a super transaction. So it's a very, very interesting problem.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I mean, I think if we were just to like really think just about how the current transaction model works, right? I think we mentioned it slightly before in the form of when a user does something, it's typically on the same chain. It's one type of transaction, and it's always going to be a user signature for that transaction. And if they want to do more and interact with different contracts, then they would have to sign multiple times, go on different interfaces. For us, how we see what we really define as super transaction, it's essentially a data model, right? And this data model basically defines very specifically what the user is going to be signing. And this could be a normal transaction, it could be an intent, it could be an off-chain Oracle trigger as well, really depending on what the use case is and what the developer wants to enable. It will allow for this, I would say, seamless, complex, multi chain coordination of actions to be done in just one signature for the user. And so for us, that's, I would say, the exciting part about it is because the user just signs once for really for a multi-instruction let's say, use case, then that basically enables the user to just interact with one interface, have no pop-ups, and just really do things like we're used to, right, in the Web2 world, where you're just easily signing away things and being able to do things very easily and quickly. Yeah, I mean, there are, I'd say, like, we could delve a bit more into like what other features like super transactions can enable, because this kind of comes in part with the collaborative execution that Mislav talks about. But yeah, for us, it's this sort of
Sure.
data model which does a lot of things.
Yeah, like please, I'd love for you to expand on some of the things that this enables.
Yeah. So when we think about like a super transaction sort of as a data model, if we were to sort of think about like a use case, and this is a demo that we actually have that's live, a user could basically, and this will come by default, what we call like, or what the industry in chain abstraction calls like unified balances. So the idea is that you will have this one smart account, and this smart account is represented on different chains. And you might have balances across all these accounts, right? And they're basically on different chains. And so when you want to, let's say, deploy some money on a lending market, and you find the highest APY, you basically want to send 50 USDC, and you don't really care about which chain it's on. And assuming that you don't have 50 USDC on that chain, then what would happen is a super transaction would specifically encode and optimize for any bridge action to actually happen, to move the 50 USD, to move the required funds, in this case 50 USDC, to basically supply to that lending protocol. And so for the user, it's one signature, but the ME node in the background is basically doing all the actions that was encoded in order for the user's intent to actually succeed, right? And this is where we call, like, this is why I like to call hybrid execution. So the idea that this is still using bridges, for example, right? Like you might hear in chain abstraction, let's remove bridges, right? And it's just going to be intense all the way down. And I don't fully, like, I'd say, believe that. I think it's going to be a hybrid. It's going to be the case of sometimes you're going to use intents, sometimes you're still going to use bridges, sometimes you might use a mix, right? And so the cool thing with super transactions, we also have support for intents, and the whole idea of resource locks, which you might have heard about with One Balance and Socket and a few others who are also, I would say, just fully going down this approach. But even with resource locks, you still need the user to actually lock the funds and then be able to do a transaction right from that instance. And so for us, we do believe we're going to be in a world where it might be the case there is an intent and then a normal transaction happening. And so for us, we see super transaction really blending in well on its own with bridges or aggregators of bridges, or it could also blend part and part with intents as well. Again, this really depends on the use case. And so this is why we see super transactions are, I'd say, very flexible. And that's just one aspect. But there's also the other aspect as well, where in a super transaction, given that there are, essentially a super transaction, this data model, right? It's all these leaves in a Merkle tree. And how does it work with like collaborative execution? If I'm a bundler on chain A and you're a bundler on chain B, we would both sign on within that super transaction, give a cryptographic commitment that we will be executing these transactions, right? And so this will be essentially recorded on chain, this cryptographic commitment from these different nodes, that this super transaction will be executed. On my side, I'll be doing a part of that super transaction and you'll be doing the other part of it. And so this, I would say, is a really interesting and novel thing that really no one has and that we're building. And this, we definitely think, we like to call it like horizontal scaling, in the concept of how do we enable different actors to come about and actually, solve for user intent in a trustless manner.
Yeah, understood. And so I wonder if you could maybe explain like some of the complexities of building this type of execution technology on EVMs versus other chains. And I'm thinking specifically of Cosmos because I have a pretty strong foothold there. And I know projects like Anoma that are building intense systems, and Agoric that have like a very different approach and allow things like async await on chain, for instance. Um, you know, how do you sort of compare the EVM landscape to these other ecosystems, and are there plans for Biconomy to also support non-EVM ecosystems?
So I maybe can give a bit of insight on top of that. So I do think that there is a need for an unifying layer on top of multiple virtual machines. And super transactions have been built from the ground up to support multiple VM standards. So there is nothing within a super transaction that says it has to be executed on EVM blockchain. The current implementation uses 4337 style smart accounts. It uses 4337 style user ops. It uses 7579 modules, etc. But that's just the implementation of the MEE standard for the EVM, right? So that every chain will have its own implementation of the MEE standard. As far as projects like Anoma or Agoric go, we know both of them. We've also had conversations with them. It's a different approach. I would say what we are doing is proof-based. So like in comparison to Agoric, which does these things like orchestration, async await stuff, they do it through using one chain within the Cosmos ecosystem as being the orchestrating chain. The MEE is a network, which is not a blockchain. And so I do think that there is a lot of value there because we are using pure proof-based execution, where you sign a cryptographic commitment, as Ahmed mentioned, as a bundler, as an intent solver. You commit yourself and you post a stake that you will actually execute what you said you will execute. And then this stake is essentially used as collateral to keep you accountable for doing the things that you promised to do. This has a lot of very interesting benefits. One of the biggest ones being that really turns up the scalability up to 100 because you no longer have the overhead of maintaining consensus. You no longer have the overhead of needing to. So like MEE could split into 5 separate smaller networks accidentally, and nothing bad would happen. Like literally the transactions would keep on going. You would either get a quote or not get a quote. You are communicating with one node. If that node knows about the entire network, fine. If it doesn't know about the entire network, fine. If somebody commits, if somebody doesn't commit or goes offline or stops, generating proofs, that's also fine. Like if there is one bundler for one chain and that bundler breaks down, the rest of the network keeps on working like as if nothing happened, right? So it's an extremely resilient cryptographic design. It's an extremely scalable cryptographic design. And so I would say that that is one of the main benefits of our approach in terms of technological implementation, instead of actually using a blockchain to do this orchestration. And we also support these things like scheduling, async await. These are all parts of the modular execution environment. We're actually working on something called the composability stack. It's using a set of predefined smart contracts on all the blockchains that integrate MEE, and it enables like seamless front-end only building of, call it like pseudo smart contracts, where you basically say the output of a transaction on chain A will be used as the input of a function call on chain B, right? Or like you call something on chain A, then wait for like 20 minutes, then call something on chain B and use the output of that as the input on chain A. And then you can build these also very interesting called promise-based, like async await smart contracts, which could theoretically enable certain things like multi-chain atomicity, in a way where you can like revert a transaction after it has been partially executed because the funds that were used for execution were held in a sort of escrow model. And we are already in discussions with several large players who are looking to integrate something like this. And yeah, so there is both approaches have their own merits. I am very much biased towards this chainless approach because I do think that even a lot of other systems and a lot of other teams have independently come to conclusions that using proof-based generation for execution is a much better way to do things. And it's sort of in a way how an optimistic rollup works, right? It sequences transactions, does things, but at the end of the day, it's all like proofs all the way down. You just prove things cryptographically, and if things go wrong, you revert them. And this seems to be the way that the entire industry is moving towards. And yeah, so it arose naturally out of technical discussions when we were designing MEE that this should not be a blockchain. It should be just like a normal peer-to-peer network with all the settlement done on actual chains that the user is interacting with.
Got it. Yeah, understood. And like, can you get into a little bit of the gasless transaction part of this, and what are some of the challenges there, and how do you optimize for gas efficiency across multiple chains? Like, how difficult is this to do, and how are you achieving it?
It's actually more difficult than people would imagine. So it was a big part of designing the protocol was how do you make sure that you enable multi-chain gas abstraction in a sense where you pay for gas on one chain and you execute transactions on multiple blockchains. And that this can also support sponsorships and that it can also support token gas payments. So let's say like one of the most common use cases now that we have with people is just like a user pays in USDC on Optimism, but executes a transaction across 5 chains, or something like that. So there are caveats, like 437 does gas sponsorships through an atomic model where, within the same transaction, gas is sponsored and the transaction is executed. So if it reverts, both the gas and the transaction revert together and the user, doesn't pay for anything. Actually, for the call gas, that there are multiple fields within the ERC 4337 standard for how do you pay for gas, but this all breaks down in a multi-chain environment because like one part of the transaction could fail, the node could potentially grift you, just take your gas and don't execute the transactions. So there was this entire mechanism designing of the staking, slashing functionality, where the node always commits to a certain cryptographic thing, where it has to execute all of the transactions on all of the blockchains. They are encoded within a Merkle tree type structure where there's a single signature that's describing multiple actions. Then there are slashing contracts on multiple chains, which the protocol can trigger to actually penalize the node for not executing things that they were supposed to execute. So a seemingly innocuous problem like sponsoring gas on multiple chains actually has far-reaching implications on how you design your protocol. One of the things also it's very interesting, like gas refunds. Like it's not always possible to accurately estimate gas ahead of time, and so you don't want to overcharge your users ever, and we don't. So the cool thing is like NEE never overcharges you for gas. You always pay exactly the amount of gas that the blockchain actually used, plus like a small premium for the MEE network itself. And so to do that, we had to figure out how to do cryptographically secure multi-chain gas refunds. Glad to say we solved that problem, as well as multiple other problems in that domain. So yeah, it was a tough nut to crack, but we did manage to solve it. Like I would call it like 4 or 5 months ago, and it's been churning on productively ever since.
Very cool. So one of the things I wanted to talk about as well is the trade-offs between, I guess, user experience and decentralization. This feels like a recurring topic amongst all types of blockchain applications, whether it's like at the infrastructure layer, at the application layer. If we look like very far into the future, where if we anticipate that most users interact with chains through some kind of abstraction layer, how do you feel about that potentially departing from some of the actual benefits of blockchains, and that the users should be interacting with censorship-resistant, decentralized platforms? Now, I think we can look at the Visa network as an example. Like every time you interact with your credit card, you're essentially trusting one company to execute a whole bunch of transactions across, potentially several different, banking networks, etc. And I think that's probably what the future of crypto looks like. But with crypto, we sort of are attached to this idea that applications should be decentralized, censorship resistant, etc. So, how does abstraction, sit within that framework, and how can we make sure that these systems actually maintain those properties?
Yeah,
MEs,
just very quickly. So there is one thing I remember that someone told me way back in the day when I first got into this space, and I'll never forget what he said. But he said like, whatever can be decentralized will be decentralized. So eventually things will there is always also there are many incentives to decentralize as well, right? Financial incentive, the fact that you could sort of see control to a bigger portion of the community to come in and be a part of the network or part of whatever you're decentralizing. So there are different incentives to that. That's number one. Number two, I would say is that Web3 UX, like my vision here is that Web3 UX will ultimately even be better than Web2 UX. Why? Purely because of the fact that users are in control. There could be privacy at some point as well. They'll be able to set, permissions on their own, and ultimately they are in control of their data, their assets, and will be able to move, their assets freely and very easily, unlike how it is in the Web2 world. And so I would say like we will ultimately get to that point. I do feel in the interim there's a lot of, there's this phase of, all right, there are decentralized apps and decentralized infrastructure. The interim is like centralized apps and decentralized infrastructure, and in the future it will be decentralized apps and decentralized infrastructure, right? And so that's really how I see where things are going. And again, I do think it's ultimately up to the apps that will probably decide how much they want to, I'd say how much centralization they'd want to have, and this will be dependent on the business, the use case, and the user base as well. So, but ultimately, I go back to the same point: Web3 UX will be better than Web2 UX, and it will just require just that bit more time.
and I'd say on the NEE side itself, on every metric that matters, NEE is decentralized, censorship resistant, permissionless, trustless. So Biconomy couldn't prevent somebody from using NEE even if we wanted to. So essentially, these are immutable smart contracts which are deployed by us but not controlled by us. They don't have admin keys. They don't have upgrade proxies. These are proper immutable smart contracts deployed on chain, on top of all of the chains that MEE is supported on. And the MEE nodes essentially simply interact with those contracts, and they cannot execute anything that wasn't explicitly permitted by the user. They will get slashed if they don't execute the things that they have been committed to. And an MEE node does not need a contract with Biconomy to join the network or a permission from Biconomy to join the network. The entire process is fully trustless and permissionless. And if all of that fails, if all of these protections are not enough, there's always an escape hatch mechanism, which is already built into the contracts themselves, where the user can always access their own funds by not going through MEE, but actually posting a transaction directly on chain. So we hold decentralization, and like not even decentralization, call it censorship resistant and permissionlessness. We hold it in very high regard, and I invite everyone to take a look at our GitHub and MEE contracts and the implementation. There's no other conclusion to come to than that Biconomy has no control over these contracts. That we have there's no special role that Biconomy takes in this network beyond being the developer of this network and the promoter of certain technological advancements. But yeah, like anyone can join, anyone can run a node, anyone can be a solver, be a bundler, be a whatever they want. So yeah, That's the beauty of designing permissionless protocols.
Yeah, I think that's super important, and glad to see that you guys are really sticking to this approach of building decentralized, censorship-resistant systems with escape hatches that people can always be certain that they're able to withdraw their funds or execute their transactions solo if they need to or if they want to. So before we wrap up here, I also want to talk a little bit about this other part of the product that is still in the works, which is the Delegated Authorization Network, or DAN. So what are you guys working on here? And like, I think maybe taking a step back, how this AI narrative and this AI agent narrative is sort of taking over right now, and a lot of people are talking about it. It's like all over Twitter. How important do you think AI agents will actually be to crypto in the next, 2 to 3 years?
Mm. Yeah, a lot to unpack. So first, I would say, or I think there are two questions. I'll start off with the first one. So Dan, right now, so how did Dan start? Right, we basically had looked into the AI agent space in general. I'd say, yeah, around like 9 months ago or so, purely because of the fact that it was an emergent space that we wanted to just invest a bit more time in to understand. And Dan was more it was more a research projects with the company that we're partnered with to look at the problems that AI agents would have, and one of them was basically guardrails around what AI agents can and can't do. And so you don't want an AI agent to basically just like use all your funds, so it would have certain permissions and stuff like that. Um, what we realized was Dan was like extremely early, and this around sort of this was summer, like June or summer of 2024. It was extremely early in its time, and what we decided to do instead was actually build our own agent, just so that we're able to understand how these things work. So we're actually building a B2C application called Nomi. Nomi is an AI assistant portfolio manager, where it allows you to use natural language to ask the agent to do transactions on your behalf. And of course, naturally, this would use an MEE under the hood as well, once it's all ready. So I'd say Dan has kind of transitioned into that. As for the AI agent part, I'm really glad you asked this question, because it's definitely something that's been on our minds, quite a bit, especially since we've looked into this market a bit earlier than others. And so we are definitely of the belief that more and more transactions, or there will be a very big significant portion of transactions that will happen via AI agents. If you look at the current landscape right now, they're really awesome, and they're showing, I wouldn't say PMF. I mean, some maybe AI XBT has some PMF because a lot of people actually rely on it, but they've done a very good job in the social arena and just content arena, right? They're basically like removing the need for KOLs to some degree, or at least they're deplatforming KOLs. To like, if I was a KOL, how will I compete with an AI agent, or will an AI agent represent me, right? And so I think on that level, what AI agents have done is just shown like the innovative nature of what AI agents can actually do. And so assuming we continue on this trajectory, then they'll be able to do transactions, right? So we haven't seen the case where AI agents are actually doing transactions at an enormous scale, right? Maybe they're tipping, maybe they're like AI XBT asked Stix for something and it paid them whatever it was, right? But have we? I would definitely say that probably that when it comes to sort of the execution side of things, it will be humans. Firstly, like getting agents to actually tell them to, hey, do these transactions, and before we get to a fully autonomous world. And so I think that's what is keeping us up at night. It's like, should we focus our ME for AI agents if they're the ones going to be doing it instead of humans, right? Because that is definitely a world we could potentially go towards.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know if you read this tweet by Hasib of Dragonfly Capital, and he talks about this, and his thesis is that that will revert back to human KOLs at some point. In like a 2 to 3 year time frame, like there will be peak AI agent, and then at some point people will start preferring the human KOLs again, for like a number of reasons that he describes in his post. I wonder if you think that this is like a long-term thing or more of a short-term kind of hype cycle.
Yeah, no, I think there will be a lot of things in hybrid when when it comes to these things. I would just say that AI agents in general are always going to be a tool for humans to just enable us to save a lot of time and effort. And if I, as a KOL, am able to really expand my reach through a super performant AI agent KOL, then why not? I think it's going to be hand in hand. There would definitely be like human KOLs that would be way better maybe than AI agents. Maybe they have a specific focus, and I haven't seen the tweet by Hasib, but I'd love to check it out. But there will be some AI agents that will be better than humans, right, in terms of the content they come out with. So I think it's not going to be this or that. It's going to be how we utilize the AI agents for our advantage, to be honest.
I think the argument for human KOLs is not going to go down to quality, because I think I agree with Ahmed 100%. There's probably going to be AI, advisors who will be better than most humans. I always see it as a scarcity argument. There will be like human KOLs will be like NFTs. It takes there's much less of them. It's much harder to produce one. So I'd say like it takes 20 years to create a human KOL. It takes probably a month to create an AI KOL. So it might become just like this type of status play thing where it's just, you follow it because it's like much rarer at the point where like AI content is. I think it's not just for KOLs. I think it's for content in general. Like I think that human generated content is going to incur a certain artistic value in the future, just due to the very fact itself that it was created by a human. And I think this is one thing where crypto is well positioned to actually be the verification layer for the fact that was it created by a human or was it not. And yeah, so I think there will be this very interesting social dynamic at play, at like AI agents becoming super hyper intelligent and being able to give great recommendations and everything, but just becoming so abundant that people get like sort of sick of it at some point, and then they revert to just human advice, maybe for even just like emotional / artistic reasons. Yeah. So that's my like hot take for the future of this.
So what's on the roadmap, and what can users and the community expect from Biconomy in the next coming months and for 2025?
So there is a lot on the roadmap. So initially, we will be we've already launched the MEE DevNet, which is basically developer preview version of the MEE and the MEE SDK. The MEE SDK will be launched now together with all the other things that we have built in the SDKs over the years. They have been unified. They have been made vendor neutral. They will be launched under the name of Abstract.js, which will be the single SDK that any developer needs to interact with any blockchain, primarily EVM now for the beginning, and to use MEE and to use account abstraction and to use 437 and all of these things through a single unified interface. We're full steam ahead. Very soon we will release a public roadmap, but we are full steam ahead on releasing the production version of MEE. So all I can say for now is that it's not far into the future, and that people should wait for the public roadmap. But we'll publish that very, very soon. And then there is the process of decentralization. We have things, I'm not sure how much and what's smart to say here, but we have things in plan for the token holders to certain, because the network itself will depend on the staking and slashing, which will be powered by the Bico token. So that there's going to be that aspect of it. So, a lot of things on our plate, a lot of exciting R&D development, launching, shipping. I think we have been on a shipping spree for the last 2 months. We've just released thing after thing after thing, and I'm hoping we keep that pace going throughout the entirety of 25.
Great. Thanks, guys. Thanks so much for coming on, and look forward to seeing more from Biconomy in the next 7 months.
I'm great about that.
Cheers.
Have a good one. Cheers. Bye.